Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear participants, Assalamu alaikum. On behalf of the Vice Chancellor, Professor Muhammad Iqbal Khan, the Dean, Professor Muhammad Amir, and the Department of Health Professions Education, I would like to welcome you all to this webinar. As you already know that this activity is a part of the CME activities, more than 180 seminars have been organized to date in this capacity building program. Today, our honorable guest speaker is going to talk about language learning, the lessons learned from COVID-19. And the main objectives are to discuss scope of online education in health professions and the lessons learned from the past. Number two, future perspective of online and face-to-face learning in health professions education. Before we proceed any further, I would like to remind you to fill up the evaluation forms and kindly keep posting your questions in the chat box. We will have a separate question answer session at the end of the presentation. I would now request Professor Muhammad Iqbal Khan to introduce and welcome our honorable guest speaker, Dr. Janet Strivens.
First of all, good morning. Probably it is good morning to you over here. It is good noon now. I welcome Professor Dr. Janet Strivens. She is a very renowned educationist and contributed in Pakistan since 2010 in the development of education, particularly in professional education. She is PhD from in education development, a professor of education development at Amir Millet University since 2018. She is a doctoral supervisor in Liverpool since 2016. Is associate director, Center of Regarding Achievements, and she also taught in the University of York and University of Birmingham prior to joining Liverpool University. He devised a curriculum for a certificate program in Pakistan with the name of ICMD, International Certificate for Medical Teachers, and initially it was under University of Health Sciences, Lahore, where since 2010 she has been contributing a lot in Punjab, particularly starting from Rawalpindi to going to the far-flung area of south of Punjab in India. She has conducted these courses periodically, and probably 3 to 4 courses in a year since 2010. There was a pause in between, and she rejoined, restarted this course at Amir Millet University since 2018. She has published a number of quality manuscripts in the research manuscripts in the different journals and the very high impacted journals from 1991 to 2020. She authored several books and chapters in the books, and also several reports and research surveys on different issues pertaining to education. She presented several papers in different conferences in Europe, in Great Britain, in Pakistan, in other countries. She has contributed a lot in Pakistan, and we are very thankful to Dr. Janet for giving us time for this important seminar, which, as Dr. Tahir has shared with you, is more than 100 seminars so far we have conducted, and it's a regular event at Shifa College of Medicine since its inception, that every last Saturday of the month we conduct a educational development seminar to educate our faculty and to educate our people. This seminar, we have guest participants from other institutions as well, and we requested Peshawar Medical College to ask their faculty to join online in this seminar. And so far, we have more than 56 participants in this seminar. This seminar today is very important, and it's the speaker is more. They also very important because this seminar is addressing our current issue. The current issue is the online education. And since the COVID restrictions were imposed, all the institution in Pakistan and abroad, they switch over to the online education, whether it is a synchronous or asynchronous. But as you know, the medical education cannot be totally conducted on online or in virtual scenario. There should be some face-to-face and virtual face-to-face blended with each other. And therefore, what lessons we have learned over the period of time during this COVID period, and what are the future prospects of this blended learning program or blended curriculum maybe be devised in future as well. So, though we have tried at Shifa College of Medicine to come up with the blended curriculum map, and the blended are the hybrid type of a curriculum map for the future, but still it needs to be more polished, more refined, so that it should be effective for our learners as well as for our with these few things, I welcome Professor Janet to this seminar. She is a very learned lady. Inshallah, she will speak on the issue, and at the end we will be having few question answer session. And I welcome you, and over to you, Professor Janet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Hello, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Can I just check that you can all see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Great. So I'm going to start by just thinking about where we're at the moment. And on this presentation, I've marked, if you like, I've marked positive things in green and negative things in red. So our present situation, during the COVID pandemic, faculty have had to learn to deliver online. It hasn't been a choice. Sorry, I'm going to move this over to the other side. And therefore, we have a faculty in dental and medical colleges who have greater familiarity with at least some technology, and hopefully therefore less fear of it. And at the same time, many institutions have improved their technological provision. And Shifa is a leading example of a university who takes educational technology seriously and is trying constantly to improve its provision in educational technology. And student expectations have changed. Students are more likely now to expect to be taught some of the time online. Although I would say we don't know very much about this change in expectations and what students think about it. Obviously, there's a lot of research going on around the world on the effects of the COVID pandemic. And one of the most interesting topics of this is the student experience. However, we know that the expectations will have changed, and students will be expecting that some of their provision will be online. On the more negative side, the technology that has been most frequently used, Zoom, but also Microsoft Teams, this has had the effect of pushing teachers back to a more didactic and less interactive style of teaching. I think that was inevitable, but it will be a theme I will pick up several times during this presentation. As you know, I've been working in Pakistan for about 15 years now, and one of the key themes of the work we've been doing with teachers in healthcare is to try to shift to more interactive, more student-centered, more active learning. And the use of synchronous platforms like Zoom have actually pushed us back towards a less interactive style of teaching. I think the limits of online learning this year have become much more clear, and that's what this presentation is about. There are three parts to it. First of all, I'm going to discuss what have we learned about delivering teaching by delivering online. Secondly, I'm going to start thinking about blended learning, and particularly these two questions. Which parts of the curriculum require the physical presence of the student? And what learning, which parts of the curriculum, benefits most from the teacher's presence? And why is that? That comes down to saying, what is the teacher's role? What are the really important things that teachers need to be physically present for? And having done that, I'm going to ask the question, why are we moving to blended learning? Why not just go back to previous practice? So let's start with thinking about what we've learned by our experience of delivering teaching online. I've titled this, What Have We Learned from Using Zoom? Because that's what most of us have been using, but this applies equally well to Microsoft Teams and other synchronous platforms. That means platforms where the teachers and the students are online at the same time, synchronously, simultaneously. And I will have things to say later in the presentation about online learning which is not synchronous. So I think one of the most important things we've learned is that some interaction is possible, but it means that faculty have got to learn to use the features of the platforms, such as polling and breakout rooms, in order to stimulate that interaction. And the chat feature, obviously, which is easier. But Shifa Zoom system has the facility to use polling and breakout rooms, and they should be used. It's relatively easy when you're teaching with online learning to link to other resources. You could argue that it's easier to learn to do this online when you're teaching online than when you're teaching face-to-face. So we need to make more use of external resources beyond what we have prepared ourselves. And I think we have also learned that content is best presented in short packages. It's a sort of axiom of online learning that videos of 15 to 20 minutes are the ideal length. And we still have this traditional idea that lectures need to be an hour and that sometimes they go on for 2 hours. And yet we know from face-to-face teaching that students' attention span is 15 to 20 minutes of real concentration. And then you need a change of stimulation in order to stop that concentration dropping. And it's easy to capture these kinds of teaching sessions, these kinds of delivery sessions, through recording and have them available for students to watch again. There is a problem that the Zoom files are very large. Files using things like narrated PowerPoints are very large, and that is a problem that needs to be overcome. And the files need to be easily accessible from the student's point of view. But nevertheless, capturing the recording itself is easy. The most negative thing we've learned, I would argue, is that it's just as hard, that means just as hard as with a lecture theatre with 500 students in it, or harder to know whether students are engaged. You can be talking on Zoom like this, you can have the pictures of everybody, but you don't really know whether they're there, you don't know whether they're listening, you don't know what else they're doing. It's really hard to know whether students are engaged synchronously, that is, at the same time that you're talking. And it's also hard to be sure that the technology that the student's using is adequate. And I don't just mean the laptops or whatever they're using as their devices. Most importantly, I mean their signal, whether they have a reliable internet connection, which allows them to join in, to listen, to take part in interactive activities like chat rooms and breakout rooms. So if we've learned all those things from our experience of the last year, what are the recommendations from this? These would be my recommendations, my 4 recommendations. I would really want to emphasize faculty training in the interactive facilities. If you're going to be using a lot of Zoom, you need to learn to use polling and breakout rooms. You need to learn and you need to do the adding of online resources for variety and better learning opportunities for the students. Don't just rely on what you've prepared yourself. This is really important as far as I'm concerned. Recordings need to be made easily available. We've had this argument in educational technology for at least the last 15 years. Lecturers have been very nervous about making recordings of their lectures available. This was when they were doing face-to-face lectures. But we've found through experience that this is really valuable to students and really appreciated by students. Yes, it might mean that a few students don't attend the synchronous event, but more students look at the recording later, more students go over the recordings to check bits they haven't understood, and they use them for revision. So it is increasingly an expectation by students that the delivery of lectures is recorded and available to them at any time. And I think we have to go with that. So there has to be a way of making recordings easily available to students. And the final recommendation, which refers back to what I said before, with online learning and recording, there's no reason to have 1 hour or 2 hour lectures. Lectures can be divided into shorter chunks. So, for example, this talk is scheduled to go on for an hour, but it could easily be divided, the recording could be easily divided into at least 3 chunks so that people could look at different parts of it and think about that before going on to another part. So that's the first part of the presentation. What have we actually learned from what we've been doing for the last 18 months? So now I'm going to go on to thinking about the idea that the Vice-Chancellor mentioned at the beginning, that in the future, learning will be blended. We need to be clear that we're talking about the same thing here. What is meant by blended learning? And if you actually look on the internet, you'll find that there are lots of different definitions. It isn't a precise concept. It doesn't mean a single thing. But at its simplest, which is how I'm using it in this presentation, what it means is that you combine the use of face-to-face learning, the teacher and the student physically present, and online learning, which could take a variety of different forms. You combine those to deliver the curriculum. So when I'm talking about blended learning, I'm talking about designing the whole curriculum, parts of which will be delivered online and parts of which will be delivered face-to-face. And this raises the key question, what's the most effective combination or blend, and for what purposes? So that's what I'm going on to talk about next. And actually there isn't a simple answer to that question, but it's a guiding question for us over the next, I think, few years in the future as we learn to blend our curriculum routinely. What's the most effective way of doing it? So the first question is about student presence. When does the student need to be physically present? And that could be in the institution, in the college or university, or in the hospital or clinic. When do they need to be physically present in order to learn? Now, I'm not going to finally answer this question, but some things are obvious. They need to be physically present in order to learn how to do physical examinations of patients. They need to be physically present in order to learn how to interact with patients. By the way, these are things that I'm claiming. You can come back and say, well, actually, we could do it this way. But these are my first thoughts, if you like, or my key thoughts about where a student needs to be physically present. And it's interesting that my second one is how to interact with patients. As some of you know, my stepdaughter is a general practitioner in this country, and during COVID, all her consultations with patients have been online via video. And she's found that very, very hard. She's constantly worried that she's going to miss something in her interactions with patients that she wouldn't miss if she had them physically there in her consulting room. So it is possible to interact with patients online, but I would argue that in order to learn to interact with patients, physical presence is much, much better. They also need to be physically present, obviously, to learn to perform lab procedures. And again, there's a big literature, not just in healthcare education, but in other lab-based subjects, about just how much you can teach lab procedures online. And that isn't to say that you can't use educational technology to help students learn about lab procedures. I'll come on to that in a minute. But to actually do them, you need to carry them out physically. And there may well be other things where you feel that physical presence of students is necessary. So I'm leaving that open, and that is something that we might discuss. And also, importantly, although I'm not going to talk about this in this presentation, we can't assess whether students can do these things unless we have them physically present. We can't know if a student can physically examine a patient unless we observe them doing it. And we can talk about that, whether there are alternative methods that are not so reliant on students' physical presence. So some of the learning for this for me, these are key questions for curriculum designers. And I am primarily a curriculum designer. That I think is my kind of main role these days as an educationalist. I design curricula more than I do this kind of face-to-face teaching. So my key question as a curriculum designer is, how much time do students need to learn these skills of doing physical examinations, interacting with patients, performing lab procedures? How do I design enough time into the curriculum for them to learn to do that and to practice sufficiently to get to the standard that they need to be at? So the second part of thinking about blending, oh yes, and sorry, and what's the best point of the programme, where they should be learned. This goes back to whether we're trying to integrate a curriculum. In many ways, it's much easier to design a curriculum where you do the basic sciences first and the clinical work later. But I would now say that best practice is seen as being a much higher level of integration. So that physical presence of students, you have to think about it at every year of the curriculum, and how much time they need with that physical presence at every point. So having thought about the student's physical presence, let's think about the teacher's role. When is it critically required? And again, these are my thoughts about the importance of the teacher's role. I think that clinical and communication skills are most effectively learned through immediate feedback from an expert. There is a lot of educational literature which argues that feedback from an expert at the point where you're trying to learn these skills is what you need in order to most effectively learn them. You can have the initial demonstration and modelling of clinical and communication skills assisted by technology. So if you're thinking about things like lab procedures, it's very commonly the case now that a video is made available to students to play through the procedure first before the student tries to do it. And the same thing goes for clinical and communication skills, that you could have videos to do that initial demonstration of what an expert practice looks like. But the student's practice and the student's learning needs that face-to-face contact in order to get the expert targeted feedback. And of course, the expert's presence is also needed for assessment. Those 2 points really go together, because the expert targeted feedback is formative assessment, but you also need it for summative assessment as well. So it's in the learning of skills where, for me, the face-to-face contact is most crucial. Conversely, in contrast, I would argue that knowledge and conceptual understanding are most effectively learned through discussion. This is one of the things that we discuss a lot during the course that we run, ICMT. The teacher is obviously best placed to guide the selection of sources and resources, to point the students in the right direction for learning. They may also be in the best place to clarify confusions and misunderstandings when the student is trying to learn this knowledge and conceptual understanding. Although we also argue in the ICMT course that sometimes peers are better placed than teachers to clarify confusions. And again, that is something we could discuss. The teacher present isn't required for assessment of knowledge and conceptual understanding, because this is generally done through writing. So this is an area where we're most familiar with using online learning, online resources to support our students. I'm not telling you anything you don't know here. You already in SHIFA are thinking about delivering your lectures online and bringing students in to the university for learning the clinical communication skills and lab work. But I'm just reinforcing those points with thinking about why it is that the teacher's role is so critical. And there's a lot of research evidence which is there to support this, this emphasis on face-to-face teaching for clinical and communication skills. So the key learning for this is curriculum designers really need to think very hard about what any period of learning is trying to achieve, what the learning objectives are, and think about to what extent those learning objectives are knowledge objectives or skills objectives. So they're thinking about what does the student need to do here in order to learn, and what does the teacher need to do in order to best support that learning, and when is it absolutely necessary for the student and the teacher to be together. That's a curriculum design issue. And there are two further questions that arise out of this for me, which is for the general faculty, how can you best support the students' learning? And how can you most effectively monitor the students' learning? And actually, you can't support the students' learning unless you can monitor it. So again, I could spend a whole hour talking about supporting and monitoring students' learning online. But clearly, it requires more than just delivering. It requires setting the students' tasks, seeing how they cope with those tasks, encouraging students to give feedback, which is another theme I will return to in this presentation. So for faculty, those are key questions: monitoring and supporting what the students are learning when they're learning in an online environment. So finally, let's look at the third question. Why are we bothering to do this at all? Why don't we just re-establish previous practices when COVID finally, as we hope it will one day, goes away? So first of all, I'm going to give you the positive arguments about why we should not just re-establish previous practices, why we should continue to use a blend of online and face-to-face learning. My first argument is that with the carefully planned use of blended learning, you will get students who are more independent, autonomous learners. And that makes it more likely that they'll become lifelong learners, which could lead to a better healthcare service in the future. I think that well-planned blended learning does give students more confidence in themselves as learners. It's the well-planned, carefully planned bit that's problematic, of course. And I'll go back to my previous slide. You do need to support the students and monitor their learning in order to make sure they are becoming more independent and more autonomous. But I believe that the payback is huge, and that you begin to see this payback even during undergraduate years, that the students are becoming more independent and better learners. And certainly at postgraduate level, you see the dividend of more confident students. My second argument is also about the benefits for teachers. I think with well-planned blended learning, you can target your teaching effort more effectively. you're not spending all your time delivering content, planning and delivering content. You can put more of your time and effort into identifying and supporting struggling students, which is really important. But you can also spend more of your time extending and developing student-specific interests. If you have students who are becoming more independent, they will ask more interesting questions. And this is a more satisfying and motivating role for teachers than simply constantly planning how to tell students stuff. So those are my positive reasons for for not just going back to where we were before COVID. But there are, if you like, more negative reasons, or at least this isn't all just good news. There is quite a lot of literature around at the moment which is basically saying we can't go back. We don't have a choice. And the reasons for that are not necessarily my two positive reasons that I've just given you, this vision for the future where we have more autonomous students and more satisfied, motivated staff. This is a paper that I was reading recently, and there's a lot more research like this going on, which was a study of post-secondary educators and trainers in Singapore. So about 1,500 university level or tertiary level educators and trainers about how they see the future after the COVID-19 era. And the vast majority of these educators and trainers have been doing precisely what has been happening in Pakistan. They've been using synchronous learning platforms like Zoom and Microsoft Teams. And the authors of this paper argue that the prospect of a significant pedagogical change with use of these limited communication tools is likely to be slim. So they are not raising expectations, as I have been doing in this presentation, that the quality of education could be better using blended learning. They are saying that pedagogical change, if we restrict online learning to synchronous learning platforms like Zoom and Microsoft Teams, it's not going to improve quality. They also argue in this paper, I mean, I've taken out the key bit that I was interested in, but what they're arguing, which is depressing, is that one of the main drivers for towards blended learning and maintaining online learning is economic, that institutions and national policymakers have discovered that online learning has the potential to be cheaper because you can record stuff and play it again. And that's a real threat because it threatens the role of the face-to-face teacher, and it also threatens the organic development of education. It makes it easier for education to always stay the same. You know, we've complained for years about teachers who go into face-to-face lectures and give the lecture that they've been giving for the last 10 or 15 years. Most of our colleagues don't do that. Most of our colleagues try to update their delivery, to look at cutting edge research and to bring that into their teaching. But if you have online resources, that's a pressure towards knowledge being static. And that is something that the authors of this particular paper are really worried about, because they think that economic pressures are more powerful than pedagogic pressures. I'd probably agree with that, towards a quality of education actually going down with blended learning. So I would argue that to realise the potential of blended learning, we have to learn to engage with pedagogically sound principles, technology that's based on pedagogically sound principles, also curriculum design based on pedagogically sound principles. As far as the technology goes, we have to have technology that allows active learning tasks, student-centred learning, and technology that encourages autonomy and lifelong learning. And that means, I said I would get back to this, technology that encourages asynchronous delivery methods, peer discussion, students learning to seek out and evaluate their own resources, and technology that encourages reflection and self-assessment. So these are my 3 recommendations. These are personal, my 3 recommendations, and I'm going to show you an example of in a minute to try to illustrate some aspects of this. My first recommendation is that we need to encourage and train faculty not only to use the interactive tools in synchronous platforms like Zoom, but to use asynchronous tools like Google Classroom. That means technological tools that allow students to learn at times which don't require the teacher and the student to be present online at the same time. So that's what I mean by asynchronous. The capacity for students to learn when the teacher is not online. At the simplest, that means recording lectures and making them available. But much more interestingly, you have the capacity for asynchronous tools like Google Classroom. And there is a learning curve for staff. I can promise you this from my own experience, but it's exciting. And I also know that Schiefer University is developing its own learning platform, which will also have these asynchronous facilities. So there needs to be a real effort to encourage staff to use them. I've already said this, I would expect all staff to use the interactive functions on synchronous platforms. And my final recommendation is we're all learning here. We have to build the evidence base, not just for international publication, but each of us in our own institutions. We have to gather and analyse the evidence from what we're doing with our blended learning. And that means continuous evaluation of programmes. We need regular feedback from students. We have to know what the students' experience of this blended learning is. One of the most exciting seminars that I've attended recently was the one Schiefer ran when they had groups of students from several different educational institutions talking about their experience during COVID. That was so informative and so valuable. So we have to go on doing that with blended learning and analyse what they say. But by analysis of results, I also mean analyse the results of summative assessment. Look at where they're learning well and where they're not learning so well, and ask ourselves, what can we do to improve the areas that students are struggling with, the troublesome knowledge, the difficult stuff they're learning. And there need to be regular team meetings of the faculty involved in this, which refine and improve the delivery strategies. And I'm just going to, at the end of this presentation, give you a quick example of how I'm currently engaged in this kind of building the evidence base with an asynchronous tool. So I'm going to come out of this. And I'm going to show you this. Can you all see this? Can you just...
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you. This is a course which we're running through SHIFA, developing through SHIFA, which is a step beyond our International Certificate in Medical Teaching. And it's been developed on Google Classrooms. I will show you I'll just show you what the classroom looks like. So every week, a minute. Why is this not working? Wait, I'm going to stream and go to classwork. That's better. Okay. So this is the classroom, and it's divided into weeks of study. There are 10 weeks, and each week there is a set of study materials and a set of assignments. Each week there is these are made available on the Sunday of each week and the weekends on Saturday, usually with submission of an assignment. Now, the study materials themselves are typically narrated PowerPoints. And because these are big files, what we have done is both have a narrated PowerPoint and an MP4 file, a video file of that narrated PowerPoint. So these two presentations are the same content in two different formats. These presentations last 15 to 20 minutes typically, and the instructions tell the group what to do with them. I can't do this that there. I need to go back here. That's right. In an assignment, sometimes we have whole class assignments, sometimes we have group assignments. So if we look at this particular group assignment, we can see that these have been assigned to 3 different groups, and 2 groups have turned in their assignments so far. The assignments give the instructions for what they have to do in a Google Doc here. So the Google Doc is provided for the group so they can see each other's and they can comment on each other's as well. So students partly interact by editing documents, partly interact through comments. But sometimes we have a whole class. There are 12 students at the moment doing this. Sometimes we have small groups with 3 or 4 students discussing together. So these are all facilities which Google Classroom gives us. I will be honest and say it's taken me probably 4 or 5 weeks with extremely good support from one of our tech-savvy students, who is Dr. Waqas Rabbani, who's running this presentation, who's been helping a lot on this. We have regular weekly meetings to see how it's going, because this is the first time we've run it. And tomorrow, Sunday, I will be having the only synchronous meeting for the students, where they can ask questions and give me feedback on what how difficult it was. Did we give them too much work? Did they have difficulty following our instructions? So that we can refine the content as we go along. And that is an example of what we would do. That is a completely online course, but it doesn't need to be, of course. It could be a part of a blended course, but most of the work is done by the students asynchronously. There is one brief synchronous meeting every week at the end of the week where we get feedback and can answer queries. So that is an example of what I mean by having a tool which has infinitely more capabilities for good pedagogical practice than a simple tool like Zoom. Wonderful though Zoom is. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop there. I have left 10 minutes, amazingly, for questions, which I'm pleased about. I'm just going to try and make my screen large again. Right. And find the, right, I'll stop the screen share and make sure that I have got the chat available. Okay, so there are questions on chat, which I hope Dr. Waqas has been monitoring, so he can direct me towards any that I miss.
Thank you so much, Dr. Janet, for providing us an insight in learning and lessons learned from COVID-19. I would like to ask that if you can elaborate on your third recommendation. How will we evaluate the program which has been delivered by hybrid model, or what can be the different steps of evaluating a program?
Evaluating the whole program, the blended program.
Yes.
Evaluation data for me always comes from two important sources. One is the feedback from the students themselves on their own experiences, which I think we should take regularly. It can be quick and easy feedback after each session, a single comment, or it can be more formal feedback at the end of a period of learning, asking several questions. But for me, that needs to be put alongside the results of assessment treated as evaluation data. So you need to know actually how the students are performing as well as how they feel about it. So I would put those two things together. So at the end of each period of learning, you have feedback from the students about what their experience was like, and those questions, some of those questions will be the same every time, but some will be targeted questions on what you specifically want to know. Maybe you have tried a particular form of, maybe you've put something online for students and you want to know how students have felt about using that particular thing. So I don't think that you can always use the same evaluation questions. You have to use some the same and some targeted. But I would then put those alongside when the students have done their examinations, analyze those results. Which areas of the curriculum are they doing well? Which areas are they struggling with? And look back at how those have been taught, delivered, and what students said about their experience of delivering. So for me, evaluation is a continuous and cyclical process of gathering the evidence, analysing it, and looking at how, as a team, looking at how that particular episode of learning could be improved next time.
So much, Dr. There is one more question from one of the participants. What can be some techniques to identify and help the struggling students to get engaged or? Did you get?
Yeah, I can see that one. What can be some techniques for identifying and helping struggling students? For me, the only way to identify struggling students is to set assessment tasks, simple formative assessment tasks. And sorry, that isn't the only way. There are two ways. One is to actually ask them directly, to fill in at the end of a session something like, you know, what was the muddiest? These are techniques that we teach on ICMT. What's the muddiest point that was in this lecture? What did you least understand? What would you like me to cover next time? But that identifies, if you like, troublesome knowledge, parts of what you're delivering that a lot of students might be struggling with. If you really want to identify individual struggling students, you do have to set small assessment tasks and monitor how those assessment tasks are done. Actually, they can be quite simple tasks, but you need to look at the students who are consistently, at worst, not handing them in, but at best doing them and having you know, misconceptions or mistakes and not getting things right. So simple continuous formative assessment for me is the most effective way of monitoring students' learning, getting students used to the idea that they're constantly going to be asked to do something with their learning. So not so that you can punish them, but so that you can just support those ones who are not adequately learning. Of course, if you have the services of demonstrators who are, and I don't know whether this happens in Shifa, but I know some other colleagues in Pakistan institutions are using this method. They're using breakout groups in Zoom where demonstrators become part of those breakout groups. So they have discussions with small groups of students on Zoom. And the demonstrators are more likely then to be able to identify the students who are not contributing, hiding, or contributing but getting things wrong, in exactly the same way that you would identify struggling students in a face-to-face environment by having small group discussion. So you can have small group discussion, but that then relies on the demonstrators to feed back to you which students are not participating, which students seem to be having problems. So those are, you put that information together, the information from formative assessment tasks, and if possible, information from demonstrators working with smaller groups of students. And those would be the ways in which I would try and identify. So what have I talked about there? I've talked about really 3 techniques. I've talked about formative assessment. I've talked about getting students to actually identify themselves through short evaluation strategies like Muddy's point, and I've talked about demonstrators giving feedback on small group discussion. There are probably others, but those will be my three first go-to strategies for identifying struggling students.
Thank you so much, Dr. Janet. Dr. Fahad Azam has a question. Would it be a good idea to combine blended learning with hybrid learning, in your opinion?
That's a really interesting question. There was a long discussion about this recently on one of our mail bases. I don't know yet. Hybrid learning is, by hybrid learning, I understand you to mean that you have simultaneously students coming in online and students with you face to face in the classroom. I think the jury is still out, as we say, on how successful this is. I think we need to experiment more with it. In theory, I can't see why it shouldn't work. Suppose you're delivering something, I mean, this is synchronous delivery, obviously. You're delivering something, you talk for 15 minutes, you have a discussion group physically in the room, you also have an online discussion group, or 2 or 3. It should be possible for all those groups to feed back to each other. A model that seems to work okay would be presentations in conferences that I've been to, where you've had questions from the audience, but also questions coming up from a chat feed alongside, where people have come into the presentation online. Obviously, it needs somebody to moderate and control that, but it should be possible. But I just don't think we've done enough of it yet to know how to do it best. So I think this is an area where people will be experimenting more, hybrid learning, but I don't think it's self-evident how to do it best.
Dr. Janet, I would like to thank you once again for sparing your valuable time. And I would now request Professor Dr. Mohammed Ahmed for the concluding remarks and protocol.
Thank you very much, Dr. Janet. It was thought-provoking. It was an intriguing type of engaging, I would not say a lecture, but I would say an interactive type of, what should we say, hybrid learning, because few of us are physically and most of our participants are online. And we usually hold such hybrid, I would say, meetings in our institution as well. And the same idea how we are getting for our students for teaching and for learning. So I think for our clinical classes who are already coming in a staggered fashion, so I think they've been using this term wrongly. We were calling it a hybrid type of teaching, but it was probably a blended teaching, I would say, but mostly it is a synchronous one. So we will be changing that term as well, because either all the student groups are online, or the whole group is there physically for learning the clinical examination methods, history taking. But when it comes to a discussion about a topic that is being held online for that 25-30 students, so that's anyhow, that's why I'm saying it is clarifying on many concepts of for all of us. The participants number has been almost close to 90 through this session. There have been many questions.
Wow. I'm sorry I haven't had time to answer more questions. I will actually, when we finish, I will read through the chat.
Yes.
And if there are questions that I think I really, need to address, I will try to send replies through perhaps to Dr. Wakas.
Sure. Thank you very much. So once again, it's an honor, as always, for us to have you with us, to learn from your experience and from your engaging method of teaching and delivering your lecture. So I think that the noble cause will continue with you and with us. So thank you very much from my side, from our side, and from all the
Very
participants.
welcome.
Thank you very much. So we concluded if there is no other discussion. So with the same dua which you have heard it before, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, wal 'asr, innal insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa 'amilus salihati wa tawassaw bil haqq wa tawassaw bis sabr. Jazakallah. Thank you very much.